A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Recently, there have been reports of sexual misconduct and even assaults committed by religious leaders. Many people are shocked and very disturbed by these reports. Is it possible to make sense of these events?
In my view, it is possible to make some sense, in fact a lot of sense, of these very disturbing events and occurrences, which unfortunately are not rare. This most recent revelation is just referring to a certain person in Tzfat, is just one in a long series of such stories and revelations, which unfortunately for the most part are true. And the facts are well known, unfortunately, around the world. In Mikwaoth, the stories about young boys being sodomized by men in the mikveh, and other stories of sexual abuse by people in the religious world are unfortunately all too well known. And one has to ask oneself, how is this possible? How can this kind of behavior be going on in a society where one would expect that, precisely in this society, one would expect it not to be the case, not to be somewhat common? I believe the answer has to do with the issue of sexual repression. I refer to the fact that there has developed in the Torah world over many centuries, there has developed a position, a school of thought, which is today by many considered to be the standard position, the normative position, the authentic view of Torah Judaism, which takes a very ascetic, puritanical and negative view of human sexuality in general. And therefore anything to do with marital relations or the sexual act is considered impure, improper, dirty, negative, undesirable, and therefore something to be shunned, something not to be spoken about, something to be ignored, repressed as much as possible. In the Talmud, from the time of the Talmud onwards, we do in fact find such a position, at least in the Talmud Bavli. We also find an opposite position, which, as I will explain, but we do find, for example, in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Nedarim, Daf Kaf Hamud Aleph 20a, and further on in 20b, we find the views of certain Chachamim, certain sages are described, who took this kind of ascetic, puritanical and largely negative attitude towards sexual relations, as is described there in detail. I won't go into all the details now, but we do find such an approach. We also find in the very same sugya, the same discussion, on Kaf Amud Bet 20b, we find this statement that the halakha is not according to these statements, but rather the halakha is that a married couple may do as they please, sexually speaking. In other words, there are not certain forms of sexual expression which are prescribed, that anything is mutar between husband and wife. Surprisingly, we find that some of the poskim, amongst the Rishonim, notably the Ravs in Balei HaNefesh, and certain poskim who follow in his footsteps, including the Shulchan Aruch, adopt this very extreme position, and they turn it into the halachic norm. And this, I believe, is very problematic. Whereas other poskim, such as the Rambam and the Rosh and the Tur and many other poskim, adopt the position which the Talmud itself adopts and recommends, which is a more down-to-earth, more balanced and more reasonable position, which does not view, apparently, so it seems, does not view sexual relations in that way. It's interesting to note that just as we find in the Catholic Church, for example, where priests must be celibate and therefore by definition are sexually repressed, we all know today, certainly, if we didn't know before, that the incidence of priests raping young boys, choir boys, etc., or priests who taught in schools, taking advantage sexually of students, etc. These kinds of activities are today well documented and well known, and we know they're very common, in fact. And the Church, of course, always covered them up. And the reason for these events, for these occurrences, is very clear. And that is because it is a nature of human beings to be sexually active. This is how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. This is how He created man. And where the natural, normal impulse and way of life is distorted and repressed, eventually it breaks out in some negative form. Something similar, not exactly the same, but something similar, I believe, occurs in some parts of the Jewish religious world, whereby, due to this negative and puritanical approach to sexual relations, which results in sexual repression, the sexual tensions and energies at some point break out in very unhealthy and very undesirable ways. The phenomenon, therefore, is not identical, but there is definitely room for comparison. The approach that we find in the Talmud Bavli, the more ascetical, more puritanical approach to sexual relations, it is interesting to note, we do not find in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and I believe there was a difference. First of all, there were these two schools of thoughts amongst the Chachamim, but it seems to me that in Eretz Yisrael the approach was much more down to earth and balanced, and not so extreme and puritanical. We find one proof of this is the fact that we find the more extreme views mentioned in detail in the Talmud Bavli, even though they are subsequently rejected by the Talmud Bavli, and yet some of the poskim follow that line nevertheless. And this has a lot to do with the influence of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, which is a separate discussion, but these things clearly do go together. In the minds of many, certainly, people who are involved in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, etc., often adopt this more extreme approach. And the other approach is also mentioned in the Talmud Bavli, and that, as we have said, should be the halacha. But it's interesting to note in the Talmud Yerushalmi, this more extreme approach does not really is not really mentioned at all. What we find, in fact, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the end of Masechet Kiddushin, is a well-known statement that Rav said, referring to food apparently. He said, "Kol atid adam liten din v'heshbon." Every person will in the future have to give a reckoning and accounting for whatever he saw with his eyes. Al kol ma shera'at eino v'lo achal. That which he saw with his eyes, any different kinds of tasty foods, such as fruits, etc., and did not wish to eat. In other words, the person will be actually punished and brought to task for not wishing to enjoy the pleasures that HaKadosh Baruch Hu presents for us and arranged for us in this world in the normal way of things, according to the Torah, everything, of course, within the parameters of what is permissible according to the Torah. The same approach, and this is mentioned in the name of Rav, this statement, the end of Kiddushin in the Talmud Yerushalmi. And Rav, of course, was originally from Eretz Yisrael. The same Rav is mentioned in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Barachot, Daf Samach Bet. A very interesting, very curious story is told there, that his student, Rav Kahana, who was from Bavel, who later moved to Eretz Yisrael, but he was from Bavel, he was a Bavli, and he in fact hid under the bed of Rav to see how Rav conducted marital relations with his wife, and with basing himself on the claim that Torah hi v'limod ani sarich. This is Torah also, and I need to know what is correct and what is proper. And the Talmud describes, elliptically, but nevertheless clearly enough, that Rav had sexual relations with his wife in a manner which indicated clearly that he had a great appetite for it, and he was very passionate about it, to the extent that Rav Kahana, his student who was hiding under the bed, eventually broke his silence and said, "It seems to me that the master is behaving in a manner which is like a man who is extremely hungry and has never tasted food before, or has never tasted the dish, so to speak, before." In other words, he was surprised at the at the appetite that Rav had for sexual relations and the passion which he brought to the event. This, I think, is indicative of a difference which existed between the approach of Rav, who was originally from Eretz Yisrael, to these matters, and the approach that Rav Kahana, originally from Bavel, had been exposed to up to that time. And this is the same Rav, as we mentioned, who is quoted at the end of the Talmud Yerushalmi and Masechet Kiddushin, as speaking about that one will be in fact judged for not wishing to partake of all the different pleasurable things that Hashem has provided for us in this world. This, I believe, is the more authentic, more correct and healthier approach to the question of human sexuality according to the Torah. This is the approach we find in the Tanakh, as I will explain perhaps on another occasion, and it is the opposite approach, the more ascetic, the more puritanical approach, which is also reminiscent of Christian influences and other influences, foreign influences that have infiltrated Torah Judaism. This other approach eventually, almost inevitably, leads to trouble.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.